Well, hello everyone, my name is Lauren. I'm telling you all about the effectiveness of Emamectin Benzoate treatments on emerald ash borer populations. So first, a quick personal anecdote. I worked over the summer at the city of River Falls as a forestry intern, and I got to spend a lot of time using this Emamectin Benzoate treatment and treating the ash trees around River Falls. So throughout that experience, I was really wondering, what more can I learn about the chemical? What impacts does it have on our emerald ash borer populations? Is this really the most effective method? And so that's why I chose this topic, and I'm going to share with all of you guys today about what I found. Okay, so first of all, what is emerald ash borer? Emerald ash borer, or EAB, is a wood-boring insect native to Asian countries of China, North Korea, South Korea, and eastern parts of Russia. But since the 1990s, you've seen populations develop in the western part of Russia, in Europe, and in North America. So they came originally to the United States in 2002, popped up in Michigan, and since 2020, we've seen 5 Canadian provinces being inhabited with EAB, 17 Russian districts, and 35 states of the United States. So it is becoming a big problem, and we're noticing a lot more severe populations growing in those already invaded areas. So the adult beetle, pictured here, has a characteristic emerald shell, and it's very long and narrow and flat. But when it bores out of the tree and into the world, you see this D-shaped exit hole. And so when that comes down the tree from its larval stage, which is here, when you see that at eye level, that D-shaped exit hole, it means that the tree is so far gone past its treatment point that it needs to be removed. So we're trying to avoid seeing any of these signs at eye level, because that means the tree is too far past its point. The larvae, these are the most damaging stage of the emerald ash borer life cycle. They are legless and with this gross, creamy white color, but they create these S-shaped galleries. And so what this does is the emerald ash borer invades the tree, starting at the top of the canopy. And then over time, the phloem tissue, that nutrient-rich tissue of the tree, is eaten away. And they eat it in this S-shaped serpentine pattern. And so typically you'll see a lot of the symptoms occurring first in the upper part of the canopy and then appearing lower as those larvae work their way through the tree system. So the S-shaped galleries, the phloem, which brings the nutrients, is cut off, and the xylem layer, which you see here, this is the xylem with the scar on it, that is bringing the water. So nutrient and water movement is prevented by the larval stage of the EAB. In their general life cycle, they start off as eggs, which are then harbored on cracks and crevices of trees for 7 to 10 days. So the female typically lays 50 to 60 eggs each time, so that you can have an intense population growing on one tree just from one female laying her eggs. After those 7 to 10 days, the larva that emerges bores into the tree until it reaches the phloem, creates the galleries, and it feeds on that phloem layer until fall, in which it then turns into a prepupa, and then hibernates inside of the tree until winter, and through winter up until spring it becomes a pupa, which then after 1 week in late spring turns into the emerald ash borer beetle and emerges out of the tree. So that's typically late May into early June that you'll see the first emergence happening. So those adult beetles come out and they feed on the emerald ash borer, or on the ash leaves for 1 to 2 weeks typically before mating. And then on that 3rd week, the females are depositing their eggs and developing the eggs inside of them, and then the cycle begins again. So typically the larvae last 1 year in the tree before emerging, but in colder climates or healthier trees, there's more phloem tissue available in the tree, or just the cold climate reduces their activity, so the larvae can last up to 2 years inside of trees, rather than having to emerge after that first year. So these are the common symptoms that you would notice in an infected tree. The bark flecking is the most common activity, or the physical symptom to notice. This is when woodpeckers are feeding on those live larvae inside of the tree, and since those S-shaped galleries are disrupting nutrient flow, the bark is much more brittle and it just breaks off. And so you're noticing this blonding on the upper canopy and then over time further down in the tree. The canopy thinning is the next big factor that you would notice, and I'll actually have another slide showing the progression over time, what the canopy would look like. But the leaves are receiving less nutrients because of those galleries, and the leaves shrink, and they might become less sparse on the tree. So over time, you just see a huge loss in leaf canopy. And I'll show you in the next slide, but I'm going to get to bark cracking, which is shown in this middle picture here. And that just happens when the xylem and phloem layers separate, and so you have this exposed area because of loss of water content. The moisture is just much lower in infected trees. And you can typically see, you can barely see it, but there is a gallery underneath this, so you usually will notice those S galleries inside of those bark cracks. D-shaped exit holes obviously are right there, but epicormic sprouting, this is in a very late stage tree where the canopy is so thin that the tree can't absorb enough nutrients, so it grows new, smaller shoots to compensate for the loss of photosynthesis in the upper canopy. So that epicormic sprouting is indicative of a tree that needs to be removed. Here's your progression over time of a healthy tree with a full canopy, 0% canopy thinning. Then over time, this is just an example of a 5-year timeline. You lose a lot of that healthy growth, and it ends up turning it into this really bare and naked looking tree with a lot of flecking. It might lose all of its bark. And those trees are actually extremely dangerous because ash trees, when they get dried out and kind of revealed like that, it's like more brittle than typical trees, and so you'll see a lot of times people remove it at this middle stage or this stage here, because when those branches fall and they hit the ground, they shatter instead of just landing. And so it's more dangerous for power lines and houses and people. So in storms, you don't want to have a dead ash tree on your property. In terms of emamectin benzoate treatments, we look at the canopy level for a viable tree. So these early stages, when there's still enough leaf cover in the upper canopy, that indicates that there's still intact vascular tissues that can transport that treatment up into the upper levels of the canopy and into the wood tissues and the leaf tissues. But once you get past that 80% stage, the larval galleries have had too much of an impact on that vascular system, so you can no longer treat it because that treatment won't be receptive for the actual tree. So the nutrients just won't get there. So, why are ash trees important? A lot of the times, we see ash trees being used for fiber production. So in forest environments, they're used as pulpwood or for paper products. So if we were to lose all the ash trees, that industry in particular would be severely impacted because ash trees make up such a big part of the pulp production in the US. And then ornamental value would be lost because in cities, typically, the ash canopy is 20 to 30% of the entire tree canopy. And sometimes it even gets up to like 50% or more. So if we were to lose all of the ash trees, all the ash trees in cities, we would be severely impacting the regulating services that the ash trees provide. So you'd have more problems with air quality, water quality, erosion, and carbon sequestration because of that general loss in photosynthesis. So this study done by Deborah McCulloch in 2007, published in 2011, shows the effectiveness of emamectin benzoate treatments against other treatments that are used to treat emerald ash borer. So I'm just going to describe the study to you guys because it's easier to understand in that way. But what they did was they took a bunch of populations of ash trees and they selected different trees in those test sites to administer different treatments. And what they treated all the trees with their trunk base sprays. There was base sprays here, and the injection systems were used for the emamectin benzoate, which is this one, and the imidacloprid is the other one. But all of the trees were administered their treatment. In June, July, and August, leaves were collected off of those trees and put into a little petri dish. The petri dishes were then given an emerald ash borer beetle inside of them, and in each petri dish, they monitored the cumulative mortality rate of the emerald ash borer beetles that were exposed to leaves with each of the different treatments. So the main takeaway was that the emamectin benzoate treatments, after 1 day of exposure, killed over 90% of the emerald ash borer beetles. So within 24 hours, they died from consuming it. The other studies, it took a little longer it was just experiment variation in July and August, but regardless of if it was in June or July or August, any of them, they all showed that it's 100% mortality rate after 4 days of being exposed to the treatment. So this shows us that emamectin benzoate is extremely efficient at killing the beetle compared to the other treatment methods that they might use. And then with the same trees in the study, they debarked them and looked at the live larval densities per square meter in that bark zone there. So in 2007, the original treatment was administered, and then they waited a year and then treated the second group in 2008. So you have a group being treated 1 time and then a group being treated 2 times. But the larval density, regardless of if it was treated once or twice, remained less than 1 larva per square meter in those treated trees with the emamectin benzoate. But you see the larval population spiking in using the other treatments as compared to how they stayed sort of at their original level if you were to retreat them. So the other treatments typically require a retreatment every single year, versus emamectin benzoate can last up to 3 years inside a tree, so you don't have to treat as often. So the additional impacts of emamectin benzoate, you might think, well, if it's killing the beetles, what else will it do? The improved photosynthesis levels the study was conducted proving that when those beetles die within the tree actually gets an opportunity to recover, and so we see improved chlorophyll counts and fluorescence, and that just means that the tree has a better chance of photosynthesizing and regaining control of its canopy after it's already been infected. With the potential neighboring effect, I actually drew this up on the board here. This is kind of a unique thing because typically treatments would only be directed towards one tree, but with emamectin benzoate, what it does is it protects its tree here. So this is the treated tree versus the control tree. And the neighboring effect is saying that any tree within this 25-meter radius around your tree is going to be protected to a certain extent. And that's because any emerald ash borer populations in these untreated trees surrounding it will likely encounter this EB treated tree at some point in the season. And so anytime, even if it's going between trees, it'll eventually hit here and die. Versus the control trees, it doesn't matter if it goes through it or not, it doesn't get affected by it. And so we see a higher population of emerald ash borers in this control area than we do in the EB treated area. And it just protects the overall canopy and increases vitality. Last thing on here is that emamectin benzoate has been proven to be safe for biological control factors. So we know that woodpeckers are the primary predator of emerald ash borers, and we see that through all the flecking that they cause, but they only eat live larvae and live beetles. So when the emamectin benzoate kills the emerald ash borer inside the tree, they're not going for that anymore, so they don't ever consume the actual treatment itself. They're only consuming the beetles themselves. And then these 2 other images here, these are 2 parasitic wasp species that attacked larvae of emerald ash borer. And a study showed that they didn't change their population size between a treatment tree and a non-treatment tree. So essentially, regardless of treatment, their population is unaffected. So emerald ash borer is still being impacted by them, but not to the same extent that emamectin benzoate can impact their population. So integrated management techniques is one of the biggest things we can do to make use of our emamectin benzoate treatments. So we know we have a 100% mortality rate from using this treatment, but if we pair it with a girdling technique, or maybe by treating it at a different time of year or using a different injection system, you've added improved value to the treatment itself. So lethal trap trees starts off with you end up girdling a tree first, which means that you remove a ring of bark off of that tree. And typically, in an untreated ash tree, the female egg-laying emerald ash borers are attracted to this girdled tree because it produces stress volatiles into the air. And so the beetles all swarm and they flock to it. And the larval density of a girdled tree can be up 3 to 4 times greater than a normal tree. So it pulls a lot of them in, targets them here. And if you've treated that tree, you've now created a lethal trap tree, which all of the eggs that are on that tree have now been exposed to the emamectin benzoate treatment. All the beetles that are in that area are consuming the leaves of the treated tree and dying. And then the larval stages would also be affected if they started to eat that infected tissue. We typically don't let the eggs turn into larvae during this process of creating a lethal trap tree. We like to remove the tree first and just debark it and mulch it so it doesn't spread any of the eggs. They don't even get a chance to survive, really. And so you're reducing a lot of that population off of one tree. The injection system, this is sort of just based on different types of injection systems. A lot of times it could just be like a direct shot into the tree. And one of the studies showed that having 8 shot ports around the tree is less effective than having 16. And that's because you're dispersing treatments further around the tree. But typically, like the city of River Falls, they're using an arbor jet equipment system that you have to drill into the tree in like evenly spaced holes around and then inject it. And this is just because more efficient injection systems are going to use more efficient chemicals, and you're dispersing it more evenly around the canopy so that more of the tissues are infected and more emerald ash borers can die from that. And the time of year is the last really important thing to consider. It's harder to judge of like how many larvae are in the tree, but in the fall, the remaining larvae that are feeding on the phloem tissues are the only thing that's going to be impacted by your treatment. If you were to treat them in the spring, all of your ash trees, you're then affecting the emerging larvae who are newly popped out of their eggs. You're affecting the larvae who might have been in the tree for a previous year and now are consuming the phloem again. And you're affecting the emerald ash borer adult beetles that are feeding on the tissues of the leaves. So it has a greater impact if you treat in the spring, and if you pair it with an efficient injection system and maybe create lethal trap trees, you can have a very efficient management plan to get rid of populations. So the main takeaway I want all of you guys to get from this is that emamectin benzoate is the most efficient method and effective method for controlling EAB populations. So if all of the ash trees in the United States, in our urban cities, were to have to be replaced and removed, that would total over $20 billion. And so by treating our trees now and implementing an effective plan and treating them early on in their infection stages, we can mitigate these costs or postpone them so that there's less damage and that we can preserve that urban canopy for future generations.
Questions for Lauren?
Did you find any studies of, so even if you treat tree every like 2 or 3 years, did you find anything about like how long that treatment will be good for, like in the future? So even if you are treating every 2 or 3 years, like how long is that tree able to live for with the treatment?
So a typical ash tree has a lifespan of 100 years. We call it a century tree. So from a young tree, for as long as you want it to be protected, you have to treat it. So if you're using those injection systems in which you need to drill holes into it, you have to drill holes in slightly off-put positions, so you're not drilling onto the same port that you used before. But really there's no downside to having to retreat it every 2 to 3 years, besides the fact that you need labor out there to do that. But the emamectin benzoate treatment will last for every 2 to 3 years. It just needs to be retreated to maintain efficacy. Oh, Eric.
What does it cost to treat a tree?
That was my question. Okay, 2 to 1. So the typical cost, it depends on how many injection sites there are, because you have to deliver a certain amount of chemical for each port. So if you had a diameter tree with, or a tree with a diameter of 20 inches, you divide that number by 2, which means that you're going to have 10 ports, and each port you do 2 injections of the treatment. This is just what the city of River Falls does. Each port was $5. So if you have 10 ports around your tree, it's going to cost $50 to treat that tree with just the chemical cost. Labor cost is not added. Typically, when you have other industries or people coming out to treat your own trees, they'll charge upwards of $300 per tree just because their labor costs are so extensive. But it really, like the treatment itself is much more cost efficient, like that chemical, versus having to remove a tree for $500 and then make up the cost elsewhere in the budget. Yeah. Yeah, Matt.
Do you know anything about, like, are green ashes more susceptible to dying than like white ash?
Yeah,
So
definitely, yes. The green ash and the black ash are more, I don't know exactly what the reason is for why they are more susceptible, but white ash have a really thin outer bark layer, and it's really hard for the larva to harbor within the tree because they're so close to the surface already. And so that's my theory. I don't know exactly why they are susceptible, but I would assume it has something to do with thickness level of bark. Maybe it would be like they're not good at harboring over the winter time, like the hibernation wouldn't be as effective because they can't go all the way into that xylem tissue and they'd be more exposed. But all the types of ash trees are susceptible to emerald ash borer, and you have seen decline in all species. Yes,
Lauren, what did you call that middle tree there?
this one here.
Yeah,
This is the focal tree.
focal tree. So does that mean that emerald ash borer travels between trees?
Yeah, so in this demonstration, I'm talking more about the adult emerald ash borer beetles that can fly between trees to feed on the leaves.
Okay.
But if you're treating a tree here and there's larvae within it, all the larvae are going to die, but the larvae can't move to other trees. It's just the adult beetle that can fly between them and feed on all of the leaves.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Is there any chance we can end up with, I don't know what they call it, herd immunity kind of an idea, where if we treat enough ash trees, the emerald ash borer population may be so low that it becomes a non-issue, or is that just wishful thinking?
it's wishful thinking to an extent. It's a lot of the studies that I was looking at were all saying, like, there's no chance that it's going to be eradicated anytime soon, but this is sort of the best shot we have at herd immunity. You would need to, if you wanted a greater chance of survival, you need to treat more of the trees around the area, not just like one focal one and like leave this whole space. So like you'd have to do like every other tree on an urban boulevard.
I see.
But I mean, the city is selecting their most valuable trees, and that's like every tree along one tree line street, because all of them are ash, and it would look weird if you lost like a strip of them.
Right.
So just, it's the management techniques and what you decide who you want to treat and which ones aren't the priority. Yeah.
Other questions for Lauren?
Eric?
I don't know if there's been any research done finding a resistant species, kind of like no elms, diseases.
Yes, the blue ash has been shown to have higher resilience and higher resistance, so like it can recover better and be more resistant to the infection. But I didn't look further into that. I just noticed that that was the one species that they pointed out, like, it could have better potential of survival. But they're not planting ash trees currently. It's not a species you could go buy at the store, just because they don't want to induce spread. And Amber, you have a question?
Yeah, have you found any effects on the tree's like development or growth when you do treat it with EAB?
So the certain treatments that you use can have different effects. There's one of the basal sprays that was in amongst other studies. They use those along the boulevard, or the Main Street Boulevard on here in River Falls, and it slows the growth of the tree, so they don't grow as fast. But typically, the ash trees grow really quickly, and so the Emamectin Benzoate treatment doesn't have any effect on that growth, at least from the studies that I looked at. But some of the basal sprays will stunt growth and prevent it from maturing fast. Any other questions?
All right, good work.